The blades roared above the desert, slicing the sky like knives. Wind howled through the open door of the police chopper, carrying the stench of sand and fuel. Inside, two officers sat tense, helmets on, visors down, while the man in cuffs knelt between them, wrists chained, face calm. He didn't beg. He didn't fight. He just stared out at the endless wasteland below, eyes steady, unblinking. "End of the line," the pilot said, smirking. The other officer kicked the prisoner's leg. "Say your prayers, tough guy. Ain't no judge where you're going." They thought he'd scream. They thought he'd cry. Instead, he smiled. The pilot frowned. "What's so funny?" The man looked up at him, voice low, carried away by the rotor wind. "You really think this is the first time I've fallen?" Before they could react, he stepped forward. One clean motion, and vanished into the clouds below. "Jesus Christ, he jumped!" the cop shouted, leaning over the door. The pilot pulled the chopper around, scanning the desert. Nothing. No body. No chute. Just wind and dust. Then the radar beeped once. Twice. Something was moving below them. Fast. Too fast. The pilot's hands trembled on the controls. "What the hell is that?" "Sir," the co-pilot whispered, eyes wide. "He's still falling, but he's standing. Stay with me until the end, because what they saw when they landed changed everything they believed about life, death, and justice." Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now let's get into it. 3 hours earlier, Detective Marcus Kane had been sitting in his squad car outside a 24-hour diner, watching steam rise from his coffee cup like ghosts in the neon light. The radio crackled with the usual midnight chatter, domestic disputes, drunk drivers, nothing that required his particular skill set. Kane wasn't your average cop. 20 years on the force, decorated veteran, the kind of officer they called when things got complicated. He'd seen everything the city had to offer, from petty theft to organized crime. But tonight felt different. Tonight carried the weight of something unfinished. The call came through at 11:47. Shots fired at the warehouse district. Multiple suspects. Officer down. Kane's blood turned to ice water. He knew that area, knew the abandoned buildings that stretched for miles like broken teeth against the skyline. It was where deals went bad and witnesses disappeared. He gunned the engine and tore through empty streets, sirens wailing. But when he arrived, the scene was already chaos. Patrol cars everywhere, their red and blue lights painting the concrete walls in violent colors. Paramedics loading a stretcher into an ambulance, the wounded officer's face pale but breathing. Kane approached the senior sergeant, a grizzled man named Rodriguez who'd seen more action than anyone deserved. "What's the situation?" Kane asked, surveying the scattered evidence markers and shattered glass. Rodriguez shook his head, frustration etched deep in the lines around his eyes. "Armed robbery gone sideways. 3 suspects, all connected to the Vega cartel. We got 2 of them, but the third one..." He paused, pointing toward the maze of warehouses. "He's still out there. Goes by the name Phoenix. Real name unknown. This guy's been on our radar for months." Kane studied the crime scene photos Rodriguez handed him. The aftermath looked like a war zone. Bullet holes in metal siding, overturned crates, blood trails leading in different directions. But something didn't add up. "How'd he get away?" "You had the building surrounded." "That's the thing," Rodriguez said, lowering his voice. "Witnesses say he went up, not out, not through the back door. Up, like he climbed the damn wall or something. By the time our guys reached the roof, he was gone, vanished into thin air." Kane felt that familiar itch between his shoulder blades, the one that always showed up when a case was about to get interesting. He'd heard whispers about Phoenix before, stories that sounded more like urban legends than police reports. A man who could disappear from locked rooms, who walked through crime scenes without leaving prints, who seemed to know exactly what the cops would do before they did it. Most officers dismissed the stories as myth, but Kane had learned to pay attention when myths started bleeding into reality. "I want to see the footage," Kane said. Every warehouse in the district had security cameras, part of a city initiative to crack down on illegal activity. Rodriguez led him to the mobile command unit, where technicians had already pulled the relevant video feeds. The screens flickered with grainy black and white images, timestamps racing backward until they found the moment everything went wrong. Kane watched as three figures approached the warehouse at 10:15. They moved with military precision, each one covering specific angles. No wasted motion. Professional criminals, not street thugs looking for easy money. The robbery itself was swift, efficient, over in less than 4 minutes. Then the police arrived, and everything changed. Two of the suspects surrendered immediately when surrounded, dropping their weapons and raising their hands. But the third man, the one Rodriguez called Phoenix, did something Kane had never seen in 20 years of police work. Instead of running or fighting, he looked directly at the camera, as if he could see through the lens and into Kane's eyes hours later. Then he smiled and walked straight toward the wall. What happened next defied explanation. The figure seemed to shimmer, like heat waves rising from summer asphalt, and then he was climbing. Not with ropes or equipment, just hands and feet finding purchase on smooth concrete. Within seconds, he'd scaled 30 feet of vertical wall and disappeared over the edge. The camera lost him after that, but Kane rewound the footage 3 times, studying every frame. "Has anyone run facial recognition on this guy?" Kane asked, pointing at the screen. The technician shook his head. "We tried, but look at this." He zoomed in on the suspect's face, enhancing the image as much as the system allowed. Where features should have been clear, there was only shadow and blur, as if the camera couldn't quite focus on him properly. Kane's phone buzzed with a text message from his contact at the FBI. 3 words that made his blood run cold. "He's not human." The detective stepped outside the command unit, dialing the number immediately. Agent Sarah Chen answered on the first ring, her voice tight with exhaustion. "Kane, I was hoping you wouldn't call about this one." "What do you know about Phoenix?" Kane asked, watching the crime scene techs pack up their equipment. The investigation was winding down, but his questions were just beginning. Chen was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her words carried weight that settled in Kane's stomach like lead. "Marcus, there are files about this individual that go back decades. Different cities, different names, but always the same pattern. Impossible escapes, witnesses who can't describe him clearly, security footage that never quite captures his face. We've been tracking him for years, and every time we get close, he vanishes." "Decades?" Kane repeated. "How is that possible? He looked maybe 30 years old on the footage." "That's just it," Chen said. "The first report we have dates back to 1973. Chicago. A man matching his exact description walked out of a maximum security prison through a locked cell door. Guards saw him leave, but the door never opened. Same thing in Detroit, 89. Miami, 2004, Seattle, 2012. Always the same impossible circumstances." Kane felt the world tilt slightly beneath his feet. Either Agent Chen had lost her mind, or he was dealing with something that couldn't be explained by conventional police work. "What are you saying, Sarah? That this guy's some kind of ghost?" "I'm saying that normal investigative techniques don't apply here." "And Marcus?" Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Whatever you do, don't try to take him alive. The last 3 departments that tried lost officers. Good officers who never made it home to their families." The line went dead, leaving Kane staring at his phone in the desert of the warehouse district. Around him, the crime scene was being dismantled piece by piece. Evidence bagged and tagged. Witnesses interviewed and released. But Kane knew they were missing something crucial. Some piece of the puzzle that would explain how a man could climb walls like a spider and disappear from locked rooms like smoke. He walked back to his car, mind racing through possibilities that seemed to belong in movies rather than police reports. As he reached for the door handle, his radio crackled to life with an urgent bulletin. "All units, All units. Suspect Phoenix has been located. Repeat, suspect Phoenix is in custody and being transported via helicopter to secure facility. All units stand down. Kane froze, hand on the radio. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. No unit had reported capturing Phoenix. No arrest had been made. Yet somehow, according to dispatch, the man who could walk through walls was suddenly in custody and being flown across the desert in a police helicopter. He keyed his radio, voice steady despite the ice forming in his veins. Dispatch, this is Detective Kane. Can you confirm the arresting unit and transport details for suspect Phoenix? Static filled the channel for several seconds before dispatch responded. Detective Kane, transport is being handled by Special Operations Unit 77 Alpha. No further information available at this time. Kane had never heard of Unit 77 Alpha, and in 20 years on the force, he thought he knew every division in the department. He pulled out his phone and started making calls, working his way up the chain of command. But every supervisor he reached claimed no knowledge of Phoenix's arrest or any special operations unit with that designation. The desert wind picked up, carrying sand that stung his eyes and filled his mouth with grit. Somewhere out there, a helicopter was flying through the darkness with a prisoner who shouldn't exist, operated by a unit that didn't officially exist, heading toward a destination nobody would admit to knowing. Kane climbed into his car and started the engine, following the distant sound of rotor blades that seemed to be heading deeper into the wasteland where the city's jurisdiction ended and questions went unanswered. He had no idea what he would find when he caught up to that helicopter, but 20 years of police work had taught him one thing above all others. When something doesn't make sense, it's usually because someone is working very hard to make sure it doesn't make sense. The helicopter circled like a metal vulture, its spotlight cutting through darkness, searching for something that shouldn't exist. Below them, the radar signature moved with impossible precision, maintaining altitude that defied every law of physics the pilots knew. Officer Martinez gripped his harness so tight his knuckles went white. "How is he not dead?" he whispered, voice barely audible over the rotor wash. Pilot Jackson had flown combat missions in 3 different wars, seen things that would break civilian minds, but nothing had prepared him for this. The radar showed Phoenix suspended exactly 200 feet above the desert floor, not falling, not floating, just existing in space like gravity had forgotten him. "Control, this is Air Unit 7. We have a situation that requires immediate assistance." Static answered him, then more static. The radio was dead, every frequency silent as a tomb. Jackson's co-pilot, a rookie named Stevens, pointed at their instruments with a shaking finger. "Sir, the GPS just went dark. Navigation, communications, everything electronic is failing." Below them, Phoenix hung in the air like a man standing on invisible ground. His chains had vanished, the handcuffs gone, leaving him free to move his arms in slow, deliberate gestures. He looked up at the helicopter with eyes that seemed to glow in the artificial light, and for one terrifying moment, Jackson felt those eyes looking directly through the aircraft's hull and into his soul. "He's ascending," Stevens reported, his voice cracking. "Target is rising toward our position at approximately 15 feet per second." Martinez unbuckled his safety harness and moved to the open door, weapon drawn, though he had no idea what good bullets would do against something that could walk on air. "Stay back," he shouted into the wind. "I'm warning you." Phoenix smiled again, that same expression that had chilled them before he jumped. His lips moved, forming words that somehow carried over the helicopter's noise despite the impossible distance. "Warning me about what, Officer Martinez? Death? I've been dead before. It's quite peaceful, actually." The helicopter shuddered as something invisible struck the aircraft from below. Not wind, not turbulence, but a force that felt like a giant hand pushing against the fuselage. Jackson fought the controls, but the chopper began to spin, slowly at first, then faster, caught in some kind of atmospheric whirlpool that had no scientific explanation. Emergency landing, Jackson screamed. Brace for impact. But Phoenix raised one hand, palm open, and the spinning stopped. The helicopter stabilized, hovering perfectly still in air that moments before had been trying to tear them apart. Through the windscreen, Jackson saw Phoenix floating just beyond the rotor arc, close enough to touch, close enough to see the intricate scars that covered his dark skin like a map of old battles. You want to know who I am? Phoenix said, his voice now coming from inside the helicopter, though his lips weren't moving. You want to understand what you're dealing with. Very well. But first, you need to land. There are things about your department, about your city, about your country, that you've never been told. The desert floor rushed up to meet them, as Jackson found himself following orders from a man who shouldn't exist. The landing was smooth, impossibly smooth, as if the helicopter was being guided by hands more skilled than his own. When the skids touched sand, every engine shut down simultaneously, leaving them in silence so complete it felt like being buried alive. Phoenix descended slowly, feet finding purchase on solid ground, and walked toward the aircraft with the easy stride of someone taking an evening stroll. Martinez kept his gun trained on the approaching figure, but his hands shook so badly he couldn't maintain a proper sight picture. Lower your weapon, officer, Phoenix said, stopping 10 feet from the helicopter's door. You know as well as I do that bullets won't help you here. Besides, we're on the same side. Same side, Martinez spat. You killed 2 civilians in that warehouse robbery. Phoenix tilted his head, studying Martinez with curiosity that seemed genuine. Is that what they told you? Interesting. Tell me, Officer Martinez, what do you know about the Prometheus Initiative? The name hit Jackson like a physical blow. He'd heard whispers about Prometheus during his military service. Classified projects that existed in the spaces between official documentation. Programs that dealt with subjects no rational person would believe. How do you know that name? Because I was their first success story, Phoenix replied, moving closer. 47 years ago, a young Marine named David Phoenix volunteered for an experimental program designed to create the perfect soldier. Enhanced reflexes, accelerated healing, resistance to conventional weapons. They succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. Stevens fumbled for his radio, trying to call for backup, but Phoenix shook his head sadly. Your communications have been severed from the moment you tried to murder me. No one knows you're here. No one is coming to help. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. Martinez's gun wavered. You're lying. Enhanced soldiers, genetic experiments, that's science fiction bullshit. Is it? Phoenix asked. And suddenly he was standing directly in front of Martinez, having moved faster than human eyes could track. Then explain how I survived a 300-foot fall. Explain how I can do this. He reached out and gently touched the barrel of Martinez's service weapon. The metal began to glow, then soften, then dissolve like ice in boiling water. Within seconds, the gun was gone, leaving Martinez holding empty air and staring at fingers that should have been burned, but remained perfectly unharmed. Jackson climbed out of the pilot's seat, legs unsteady, mind reeling with implications that rewrote everything he thought he knew about reality. If you're telling the truth, if you really are some kind of enhanced soldier, then why were you robbing warehouses? Why kill innocent people? Phoenix's expression darkened, and for the first time since they'd encountered him, he looked genuinely angry. I wasn't robbing anything, Pilot Jackson. I was investigating. Those warehouses contained evidence of something far worse than petty crime. Documents, photographs, shipping records that prove your police department has been working with human traffickers for years. The words hung in the desert air like poison. Martinez backed away, shaking his head. That's impossible. We're cops. We protect people. Some of you do, Phoenix agreed. But others, the ones who gave you orders to throw me from this helicopter, they've been profiting from misery for longer than you can imagine. Children disappearing from foster care, young women vanishing from homeless shelters, Immigrants who cross the border and are never seen again. All of it orchestrated by men wearing badges. Stevens was crying now, tears streaming down his young face. I don't understand any of this. I just wanted to serve my community, help people, make a difference. Phoenix's anger softened into something that might have been compassion. You still can, Officer Stevens. All of you can. But first, you need to understand what you're really fighting against. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a thick manila envelope, edges worn from handling. These are copies of every document I recovered from that warehouse before your colleagues arrived. Names, dates, financial records, photographs that will make you sick to look at. But you need to see them. You need to know who you're really working for. Jackson took the envelope with trembling hands. The weight of it felt heavier than paper and ink should feel. Heavy with the weight of truth that would shatter comfortable lies. Why are you giving this to us? We just tried to kill you. Because you're not evil, Phoenix said simply. Misguided, yes. Manipulated, absolutely. But not evil. The men who sent you here, who told you I was a dangerous criminal who needed to be eliminated, they are something else entirely. Martinez sat down heavily in the sand, head in his hands. Jesus Christ, what have we done? You've been used, Phoenix replied, just like I was used. 47 years ago when they promised me I'd be protecting America from its enemies. Instead, I became a weapon for men who see human beings as profit margins and acceptable losses. The desert wind picked up again, carrying the scent of distant rain and the promise of storms to come. Phoenix looked toward the horizon where the lights of the city painted the sky in shades of amber and crimson. Your communications will be restored in exactly 30 minutes. Long enough for you to read those files, to understand what you're dealing with. Then you'll have a choice to make. Stevens wiped his eyes and stood up straighter. What kind of choice? Whether to go back to your precinct and pretend this never happened. File a report that I died in the fall and hope your supervisors reward your loyalty. Phoenix paused, meeting each of their gazes in turn. Or whether to help me expose the corruption that's been eating your department from the inside out. Jackson opened the envelope and pulled out the first photograph. His face went pale, then green. The image showed children, dozens of them, locked in cages that looked more like animal kennels than anything meant for humans. In the corner of the photo, barely visible but unmistakable, was a police evidence tag with the department's logo clearly visible. This is from last month, Phoenix said quietly. Recovered from a shipping container at the docks. Every child in that picture was reported as a runaway. Every missing person report was filed and then mysteriously lost in the system. The container was supposed to be destroyed as evidence, but it was sold to private buyers instead. Martinez grabbed the envelope and rifled through more documents. Bank statements showing regular payments to senior officers. Shipping manifests with human cargo disguised as legitimate imports. Communication logs between police dispatchers and criminal organizations coordinating the disappearance of vulnerable people. How long has this been going on? Martinez whispered. At least 15 years, Phoenix answered. Probably longer. The network extends beyond your city, beyond your state. It's a machine that feeds on human suffering, and it's been protected by the very people sworn to stop it. Stevens was reading over Jackson's shoulder, his face growing paler with each page. Captain Rodriguez is on these financial records. Sergeant Williams, Lieutenant Nash, people I've looked up to, people I trusted. Trust is a luxury you can no longer afford, Phoenix said. But hope isn't. There are still good officers in your department, people who joined for the right reasons and haven't been corrupted yet. Find them, protect them, help them understand what they're really fighting. The helicopter's radio crackled back to life, cutting through the desert silence like a knife. Dispatch was calling their unit number, requesting status updates, growing more agitated with each unanswered transmission. Phoenix stepped back, preparing to disappear again into the darkness that had birthed him. Remember, he said, his voice already fading as shadows seemed to embrace him. You have 30 minutes to decide who you really want to be. Choose wisely. Lives depend on it. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Jackson stared at the radio, its static-filled voice demanding answers they couldn't give, while Martinez clutched the damning photographs with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The evidence spread across the desert sand painted a picture darker than the moonless sky above them. Stevens broke first. His voice cracked as he keyed the radio. "Dispatch, this is Air Unit 7. We're experiencing mechanical difficulties. Requesting immediate ground support at coordinates." He looked at Jackson, who shook his head slowly. "No coordinates," Jackson whispered. "Not yet." The radio squawked again. "Air Unit 7, your transponder went dark 40 minutes ago. What is your status?" Phoenix's words echoed in the desert wind. "Choose wisely. Lives depend on it." Jackson had flown missions where split-second decisions meant the difference between soldiers coming home or returning in flag-draped boxes. But this felt different. This felt like choosing between the man he'd been and the man he could become. Martinez stood up, sand falling from his uniform like the last remnants of his old life. "We can't go back," he said quietly. "Not after seeing this. How do we face the families of missing kids knowing we work for the people who took them?" Stevens was younger, less seasoned, but his eyes held the fire of someone who'd joined the force to make a difference. "My little sister is 16. She runs away sometimes when things get bad at home. What if she'd been one of those kids in the photos?" The radio crackled with increasing urgency. Captain Rodriguez's voice cut through the static, sharp with authority and barely concealed panic. "All units be advised. Air Unit 7 is overdue for check-in. Consider crew potentially compromised. Initiate search and recovery protocols immediately." Jackson felt ice form in his stomach. Rodriguez was one of the names on Phoenix's financial records. The captain wasn't worried about their safety. He was worried about what they might have learned. "They're coming for us," Jackson said, scanning the horizon for aircraft lights. "Rodriguez knows we were sent to kill Phoenix. If we survived and he didn't die, questions get asked. Uncomfortable questions." Martinez kicked at the sand, sending up small clouds that caught the helicopter's emergency lighting. "So what do we do? Run? Hide? Spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders?" "We fight," Stevens said, surprising them both with the steel in his voice. Phoenix said there were good cops left in the department, people who joined for the right reasons. "We find them." Jackson pulled out his personal cell phone, scrolling through contacts accumulated over 2 decades of service. "Detective Sarah Mitchell, Narcotics Division. She's clean. Has to be. I've seen her turn down bribes that would have bought her a house." "What about Internal Affairs?" Martinez asked. "Captain Torres runs that division. He's old school by the book." "Torres is dirty," Stevens said quietly. Both older officers stared at him. "I saw him at the warehouse district last month. Private meeting with some guy in an expensive suit. Envelope changed hands. I thought it was an informant thing, but now..." The radio exploded with activity. Multiple units being dispatched to their last known location. Search helicopters launching. The machinery of a corrupt system mobilizing to silence potential threats. Jackson made his decision. He grabbed the radio and keyed the microphone. "Dispatch, this is Air Unit 7. We have emergency landed due to engine failure. All crew members are safe. Beginning diagnostic procedures. Will advise when ready for extraction." "Copy that, Air Unit 7. Ground units are en route to your position for assistance." Jackson switched off the radio and yanked out the battery pack. "That buys us maybe an hour before they triangulate our position, using the helicopter's emergency beacon." Martinez was studying the documents again, his face grim in the artificial light. "Look at this shipping manifest. Container ship arriving tomorrow night. Pier 17. Same code words Phoenix found in the warehouse records." Stevens leaned over his shoulder. 43 passengers listed as agricultural workers. But the ship's manifest shows cargo capacity only. No passenger accommodations. "Because they're not passengers," Jackson said, the pieces falling into place like bullets loading into a chamber. "They're cargo. Human cargo." The desert wind carried the distant sound of rotor blades. Multiple aircraft, closing fast. Jackson killed the helicopter's emergency lights, plunging them into darkness broken only by stars and the faint glow of the city on the horizon. "We need to move," Martinez said, stuffing the documents inside his vest. "They'll have thermal imaging, heat signatures." But Stevens was shaking his head. "Move where? We're 40 miles from the city limits. No vehicle, no backup, no way to communicate with anyone who might help us." Jackson smiled grimly. 20 years of military and police service had taught him that impossible situations required impossible solutions. Phoenix said our communications would be restored. That means he's still out there, still watching. As if summoned by his words, a voice drifted from the darkness beyond their vision. "You chose correctly, officers. But choosing is only the beginning." Phoenix materialized from shadows that seemed too thin to hide a man. His movement so fluid, it looked like he was walking on water instead of sand. The approaching helicopters were closer now, their searchlights beginning to sweep the desert in expanding patterns. "They'll kill us," Martinez said simply. "Soon as they realize we know the truth, we're dead men." "Not if you're already dead," Phoenix replied. "At least not officially." He reached into his jacket and withdrew 3 small devices that looked like military-grade smoke grenades. "Thermite charges. They'll turn your helicopter into molten metal and ash. Perfect cover for 3 officers who died heroically in a crash while pursuing a dangerous fugitive." Stevens backed away. "You want us to fake our own deaths? I want you to disappear long enough to expose the truth," Phoenix corrected. "Dead men don't have to follow department protocols. Dead men can investigate without warrants, gather evidence without probable cause, and take action without worrying about internal politics." The searchlights were sweeping closer. Jackson could make out the silhouettes of at least 3 aircraft, probably more following behind. "How do we know you're not leading us into a trap? How do we know you're really one of the good guys?" Phoenix's scarred face softened with something that might have been sadness. "Because 47 years ago, 3 officers just like you were faced with the same choice. They chose wrong. They followed orders, kept quiet, and let innocent people die to protect a system that was already rotten. I've been carrying their names ever since." He pulled out a worn photograph showing 4 young men in military uniforms, arms around each other's shoulders, smiling with the confidence of soldiers who believed they were fighting for something worth dying for. Phoenix pointed to the faces one by one. "Lieutenant James Morrison, Sergeant Carl Hughes, Corporal Mike Stevens." He looked directly at the young officer. "Your grandfather." Stevens staggered backward as if he'd been struck. "That's impossible. Grandpa died in Vietnam. I have his Purple Heart. He died in a black site prison in Nevada," Phoenix said quietly. "Executed for refusing to participate in human experimentation. The Purple Heart was part of the cover story, just like the helicopter crash will be part of yours if you choose to walk away." The searchlights found them. Brilliant white beams that turned the desert into a stage. 3 officers and 1 impossible man caught in the glare, like actors in a play about corruption and conscience. Martinez grabbed one of the thermite charges. "What happens after we're dead? You become something more dangerous than cops," Phoenix replied, his voice carrying over the approaching rotor noise. "You become ghosts with a mission, and ghosts can go places the living never could." Stevens took another charge, his young face set with determination that aged him 10 years in 10 seconds. "The ship tomorrow night, Pier 17. We stop it, we document it, record everything, get proof that can't be buried or discredited. Then we broadcast it to every news outlet, every social media platform, every person with a conscience and a computer." Jackson was the last to take a thermite charge, weighing it in his hands like he was weighing his entire future. The helicopters were close enough now to make out individual crew members through the windows. He recognized Captain Rodriguez in the lead aircraft, and the man's expression promised violence. "Once we do this, there's no going back," Jackson said. "There was no going back the moment you saw those photographs," Phoenix replied. The only question now is whether you die as accomplices or as heroes. The searchlights blazed brighter. Voices echoed across the desert through loudspeakers, ordering them to step away from the aircraft and surrender. Jackson could see weapons being readied in the approaching helicopters. These weren't rescue crews. They were executioners. "On my mark," Phoenix said, raising his hand. 3, 2. Martinez was already moving, placing his charge against the helicopter's fuel tank. Stevens did the same near the engine compartment. Jackson positioned his device near the cockpit, where it would ensure maximum destruction. 1. The charges detonated simultaneously, turning their aircraft into a brief star that blazed against the desert night. Metal screamed and twisted. Fuel ignited in a pillar of flame that reached toward the stars like an accusation against heaven itself. Through the fire and smoke, 3 figures ran toward the darkness, following a 4th who moved like smoke given form. Behind them, the approaching helicopters circled the wreckage, their crews believing they were witnessing the end of 3 officers who had learned too much. They were wrong. It was only the beginning. Phoenix led them through arroyos and dried creek beds, paths invisible to aircraft, but worn deep by flash floods and time. They moved in single file, communication reduced to hand signals and shared understanding that their old lives had burned with the helicopter. After an hour of hard travel, they reached a rocky outcrop that provided shelter from both aerial observation and the desert cold. Phoenix produced water bottles and energy bars from a cache hidden among the stones. "How long have you been planning this?" Jackson asked, accepting the supplies gratefully. "Since the day I escaped from the Prometheus facility," Phoenix replied. "I've been building a network of people who've seen too much, learned too much, survived too much to stay silent. Officers like you, soldiers who asked the wrong questions, civilians who witnessed things they were supposed to forget." Stevens was staring at his hands, still shaking from adrenaline and revelation. "My grandfather, tell me what really happened to him." Phoenix sat down across from the young officer, his expression gentle despite the hard lines carved by decades of conflict. He found evidence that the military was using homeless veterans as test subjects for experimental drugs, mind control research, pain tolerance studies, genetic modification attempts. When he tried to report it through proper channels, he discovered the experiments were being conducted with full knowledge and approval of senior command. So he went public. He tried to. But in 1973, there was no internet, no social media, no way for a single soldier to expose military secrets without help from major news outlets. And those outlets were already being pressured to stay quiet about government programs. Martinez had been listening while keeping watch on the horizon. What happened to the other 2? Morrison and Hughes? Morrison was found dead in his apartment. Apparent suicide, though he'd left his wife and kids a note saying he'd never hurt himself. Hughes disappeared entirely. His body was found 6 months later in the desert, not far from where we're sitting now. The weight of family history settled on Stevens like a physical burden. "And you? How did you survive?" Phoenix's smile held no warmth, "Because they needed me alive. The experiments had worked too well. I'd become something they couldn't replicate but couldn't afford to lose. So they kept me locked away, brought out only for the jobs that required someone expendable but unkillable. Until you escaped. Until I stopped pretending to be their weapon and remembered I was supposed to be a soldier. Soldiers protect people. They don't exploit them." Jackson checked his watch. 3 hours until dawn. The container ship would dock in 18 hours. "What's the plan for tomorrow night?" Phoenix pulled out a tablet computer, its screen showing detailed schematics of the harbor district. Pier 17 has limited security cameras, but they're all connected to a central monitoring station that's staffed by Port Authority police. Good cops mostly, but they follow orders without asking questions. "Can we get inside without being seen?" "Not through normal channels, but I've been modifying the harbor's security system for weeks. Tomorrow night, every camera at Pier 17 will experience a technical malfunction that lasts exactly 43 minutes, long enough for us to document what's in that container and get out." Martinez studied the tablet screen. 4 of us against however many guards they'll have? Those aren't great odds. We're not there to fight, Phoenix corrected. We're there to gather evidence. Video, audio, photographs that prove human trafficking is happening with police department knowledge and participation. Once we have that proof, we broadcast us. Stevens was quieted everywhere before they can silence for a long moment, processing everything they'd learned. What about our families? Our friends? Soon as this goes public, they'll be targets too. Phoenix nodded gravely. That's the hardest part. You'll have to stay dead to them. Let them grieve. Let them move on. It's the only way to keep them safe. The young officer's voice broke slightly. My mom. She's already lost my dad and my grandfather. Now she'll think she's lost me too. She'll understand when the truth comes out, Jackson said, placing a hand on Stevens's shoulder. When those kids in the photographs go home to their families, when the trafficking network is exposed and destroyed, she'll understand why you had to disappear. Phoenix stood up, scanning the horizon where the first hints of dawn were beginning to paint the eastern sky. We need to move. There's a safe house 20 miles north of here. Food, weapons, communication equipment, everything we'll need to prepare for tomorrow night. They gathered their supplies and prepared to leave the rocky shelter that had protected them through the darkest hours of the night. As they walked single file through the desert, following paths known only to Phoenix and the creatures that called this wasteland home, each man carried the weight of choices that could never be unmade. Behind them, smoke still rose from the wreckage of their helicopter. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, but the deception was complete. 3 officers were officially dead, killed in the line of duty while pursuing a dangerous fugitive. Ahead of them lay a future none of them could have imagined 12 hours ago. They were ghosts now, invisible to the system they'd once served, free to move through shadows and expose truths that had been buried under layers of corruption and conspiracy. The sun broke over the eastern mountains, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. A new day was dawning, and with it, the beginning of a war that would determine whether justice was still possible in a world where the Guardians had become predators. Phoenix looked back at his 3 companions, these officers who had chosen truth over comfort, danger over security, justice over survival. Welcome to the resistance, he said quietly. Now let's go save some lives. The safe house emerged from the desert like a mirage made real, built into the side of a mesa, camouflaged by rock and shadow. It looked like nothing more than another geological formation until Phoenix pressed his palm against what appeared to be solid stone. A section of the wall slid aside with mechanical precision, revealing a corridor lit by soft blue light. Biometric scanner, Phoenix explained as they stepped inside. The entire facility is off-grid, solar-powered, water recycled, completely invisible to satellite surveillance. Stevens whistled low as they entered the main chamber. Banks of computer monitors lined one wall, displaying feeds from security cameras across the city. Communication equipment hummed quietly in temperature-controlled cabinets. Weapons lockers stood open, revealing an arsenal that would make a military unit envious. How many people know about this place? Martinez asked, running his fingers along a workbench covered with electronic components and surveillance gear. 4, counting myself, Phoenix replied. 2 others like me, enhanced soldiers who broke free from government control, and 1 civilian who learned too much and chose to help rather than stay silent. Jackson was studying the camera feeds, recognizing locations throughout their former patrol areas. You've been watching the entire department for months. Years, Phoenix corrected. Every corrupt transaction, every covered-up crime, every innocent person who disappeared into the system. I've documented it all. 1 monitor showed the smoking wreckage of their helicopter, surrounded by emergency vehicles and investigators combing through the debris. Captain Rodriguez stood apart from the scene, talking urgently into a satellite phone, his face twisted with frustration. He knows we're alive, Stevens observed. Look at his body language. That's not a man mourning dead officers. Phoenix nodded grimly. Rodriguez has been the point man for the trafficking operation for 8 years. He personally selected which missing persons cases got buried, which investigations got derailed. Your deaths were supposed to be clean, final, no loose ends. Martinez slumped into a chair beside the communications array. So what happens when the debris analysis comes back? When they don't find 3 bodies in that wreckage? They'll find bodies, Phoenix said quietly. I made sure of that. The 3 officers stared at him. Jackson felt ice form in his stomach. What do you mean? Phoenix pulled up a file on one of the computers. Morgue records, death certificates, burial permits. 3 homeless veterans who died of exposure last winter. John Doe's buried in unmarked graves. Tonight, their remains were transferred to your helicopter before the charges detonated. Stevens looked sick. You desecrated graves? Used dead men as props? I gave 3 forgotten soldiers the chance to serve their country one last time, Phoenix replied, his voice steady but not without pain. They died alone, unmourned, forgotten by the system they served. Now they'll be remembered as heroes who died fighting corruption. The moral complexity of their situation settled over them like a weight. They were alive because dead men had taken their places. Heroes because homeless veterans had become their stand-ins. The mathematics of sacrifice didn't balance, but then again, nothing about their situation followed normal equations. Jackson turned back to the monitors, focusing on practical concerns rather than philosophical ones. Show us everything you have on tomorrow night's shipment. Phoenix's fingers flew across multiple keyboards, bringing up shipping manifests, port authority schedules, and surveillance footage from previous container arrivals. The Meridian Star docks at 11:47 p.m., container designation HC7739. According to official records, it contains agricultural equipment bound for distribution centers in 3 states. But the real cargo? Martinez asked, though he already knew the answer would be terrible. 43 people, men, women, children, sold into labor trafficking, sex trafficking, or worse. The buyers are already in the city, staying at hotels owned by shell companies connected to your department's pension fund. Stevens was reading over Phoenix's shoulder, his young face hardening with each detail. How do you know all this? Because I've been tracking this network for 15 years. Every shipment, every transaction, every life destroyed in the name of profit. Phoenix pulled up photographs that made Jackson look away. Children's faces, hollow-eyed and desperate. Women who looked like they'd already died inside. Men whose spirits had been broken by horrors their minds couldn't process. The container will be moved to Warehouse 7 within 2 hours of docking, Phoenix continued. That's where the sorting happens. Buyers inspect their purchases, make final selections, arrange transport to final destinations. Martinez was studying architectural plans of the warehouse district. Security? Minimal official presence. 2 Port Authority guards on patrol, standard routes every 30 minutes. But unofficial security is heavy. Private contractors, off-duty police officers, military veterans hired through shell companies. How many? Jackson asked. 12 to 15 armed personnel, all connected to the trafficking network in some way, all willing to kill to protect their operation. The numbers weren't encouraging. 4 men against 15, even with Phoenix's enhanced abilities, meant casualties were inevitable, but the alternative was letting 43 innocent people disappear into slavery or worse. Phoenix seemed to read their thoughts. We're not going and shooting. Violence creates chaos, and chaos destroys evidence. We need documentation that will stand up in court, testimony that can't be dismissed as fabrication. He pulled up detailed schematics of Warehouse 7, showing ventilation systems, electrical conduits, and structural supports. The building has been modified with hidden chambers for processing human cargo, soundproofed rooms, medical facilities for health inspections, holding areas designed like prison cells. Stevens traced the building's layout with his finger. Entry points? 3 main entrances, all monitored. But there's a maintenance tunnel that connects to the city's storm drain system. It emerges inside the warehouse basement, beneath the holding cells. Perfect place to plant recording devices, Martinez observed. Get everything on video and audio. Phoenix nodded. The buyers always arrive at 2 a.m. They like to inspect their merchandise in private, negotiate prices, arrange special requests. We'll have approximately 90 minutes to document everything before the containers are loaded onto transport trucks. Jackson was thinking tactically, his military training overriding emotional reactions to the horror they were discussing. Extraction plan? Same route we use for entry. But there's a complication. Phoenix highlighted a section of the tunnel system. The maintenance access floods during high tide. Tomorrow night, high tide occurs at 3:37 a.m. Cutting it close, Martinez muttered. Very close. If we're not out by 3:15, we'll be trapped until the next low tide 6 hours later. And by then, the warehouse will be crawling with cleanup crews destroying evidence. Stevens was quiet for a long moment, processing the risks they were about to accept. What about the people in those containers? The ones being trafficked? Do we just document their suffering and leave them? Phoenix's expression softened with something that might have been pride. That's exactly the question I hoped you'd ask. No, Officer Stevens. We don't just document. We document, broadcast, and then we extract as many as possible before the authorities arrive. Authorities we can trust? Jackson asked skeptically. FBI units that have been investigating this network from the federal level. Agent Sarah Chen has been building a case for years, but she needed local evidence, local witnesses, local proof that couldn't be dismissed as federal overreach. The same Agent Chen who had warned Jackson about Phoenix being dangerous. The irony wasn't lost on him. She knew about you all along. She's been tracking me for 15 years, trying to determine if I was part of the problem or part of the solution. Tomorrow night will give her the answer she needs. Phoenix stood up and walked to one of the weapons lockers. We leave at sunset. 6 hours to prepare equipment, memorize layouts, and make peace with the possibility that we might not survive this. Martinez was still studying the warehouse schematics. What happens if we get caught? I mean, officially we're dead. No backup, no legal protection, no way to call for help. Then we disappear permanently, Phoenix said simply. But 43 innocent people live free lives instead of dying in slavery. The mathematics of sacrifice, gentlemen. Sometimes the equation balances in favor of strangers. Stevens was examining the surveillance equipment they'd be carrying. Micro cameras, directional microphones, transmitters that could broadcast live feeds to multiple recipients simultaneously. This gear is military grade. How did you acquire it? Friends in dark places, Phoenix replied. People who believe that some missions are worth the risk, regardless of official authorization. The afternoon passed quickly as they prepared for the night's operation. Jackson found himself thinking about his wife, who would be receiving notification of his death within hours. The grief she would experience, the questions she would ask, the suspicions she might have about the official story. Martinez wrote letters he would never send, final words to children who would grow up believing their father had died a hero's death. The truth was more complicated than heroism, but sometimes complications were luxuries that good men couldn't afford. Stevens called his mother's phone number, but didn't complete the call. Instead, he listened to her voicemail greeting, memorizing the sound of her voice saying words of love and welcome that he might never hear again. Phoenix worked methodically through equipment checks and contingency planning, but his movements carried the weight of decades spent fighting battles that officially never happened. He'd lost friends, lovers, family members to the war between those who profited from human suffering and those who died trying to stop it. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, the four men gathered around the central table one last time. Phoenix spread out maps showing their route through the storm drain system, entry points into the warehouse, and extraction paths that led back to safety. Questions? He asked. Just one, Jackson said. After tonight, after we expose this network, what happens to us? Do we stay dead forever? Phoenix was quiet for a long moment, looking at each of them with eyes that had seen too much death and not enough justice. That depends on how much of the world we manage to save. Sometimes heroes get to come home. Sometimes they don't. And sometimes, Stevens added quietly, being a hero means accepting that home isn't where you left it. Martinez checked his watch. Sunset in 30 minutes. Let's go save some lives. They gathered their equipment in silence, each man carrying gear that weighed far less than the responsibility they'd accepted. Outside, the desert. Wind was picking up, carrying the scent of distant rain and the promise of storms to come. Phoenix sealed the safe house behind them, and they began their journey toward the city lights that marked the boundary between the wilderness they'd crossed and the urban battlefield they were about to enter. Above them, the first stars were becoming visible in the deepening sky, celestial witnesses to human choices that would echo through lives they would never know. The container ship Meridian Star was already visible on the horizon, its lights cutting through the gathering dusk as it approached the harbor with its cargo of human misery. In 6 hours, 43 people would either be free or lost forever to a system that treated them as merchandise. 4 dead men walked through the desert toward their resurrection or their final burial, carrying the weight of justice on their shoulders and the hope of strangers in their hearts. The war between good and evil had many battles, but tonight's engagement would determine whether innocence could still triumph over profit, whether courage could still overcome corruption, and whether 4 officers who had chosen death over compromise could still find a way to choose life over surrender. The city grew larger with each step, its lights promising both salvation and damnation depending on the choices they would make in the hours ahead. The storm drains beneath the city stretched like concrete arteries, carrying more than just rainwater through their veins. Jackson led the way through knee-deep sludge, his flashlight cutting through darkness that seemed to swallow light itself. Behind him, Martinez and Stevens moved with practiced silence, their breathing controlled despite the stench that rose from decades of urban decay. Phoenix brought up the rear, his enhanced senses tracking sounds no normal human could detect. Footsteps above ground, conversations filtering through storm grates, the distant rumble of machinery that shouldn't be running at this hour. Every sound painted a picture of the operation they were about to infiltrate. "Movement up ahead," Phoenix whispered, his voice carrying perfectly despite the ambient noise of dripping water and settling concrete. 2 guards. Standard patrol pattern. They'll pass the maintenance hatch in 90 seconds. Jackson checked his watch. 10:37 p.m. The Meridian Star would dock in 70 minutes, its cargo of human suffering ready for processing and distribution. Time was becoming their enemy, each second ticking toward a moment when 43 lives would either find freedom or disappear forever into a system designed to erase their existence. The tunnel narrowed as they approached the warehouse district, forcing them to move single file through passages that felt more like burial chambers than infrastructure. Martinez's breathing became labored, not from exertion, but from the weight of what they were about to witness. He'd seen crime scenes before, dealt with violence and cruelty in all their forms. But this was different. This was systematic destruction of human dignity on an industrial scale. Stevens clutched his recording equipment like a lifeline, checking battery levels and memory capacity for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. Everything had to be perfect. One corrupted file, one dead battery, one moment of technical failure could mean the difference between justice and continued suffering for countless victims. Phoenix held up his hand, signaling a halt. Above them, heavy footsteps echoed through the maintenance hatch, accompanied by muffled voices discussing shipping schedules and payment arrangements. The guards were exactly where intelligence had predicted, following patterns that had been observed and documented over months of surveillance. "They're moving off," Phoenix reported after an eternal minute of listening. "Hatch is clear for 30 seconds. Jackson moved first, ascending the ladder with practiced efficiency despite equipment that made every movement awkward. The hatch opened into a storage room filled with shipping containers that had been modified for purposes no legitimate business would acknowledge. Ventilation holes drilled at eye level, reinforced locks on the outside. drain systems that spoke of human occupancy rather than cargo storage. One by one, they emerged into the warehouse basement, their flashlights revealing a scene that validated every horrible suspicion Phoenix had shared. Holding cells lined one wall, each barely large enough for a person to lie down. Medical equipment occupied another corner, instruments designed for health inspections that treated human beings like livestock at auction. Martinez photographed everything, his camera flash creating stark shadows that seemed to emphasize the inhumanity of their surroundings. Each image would serve as evidence in trials that might never happen, testimony from witnesses who might not survive to speak for themselves. Stevens was installing micro cameras in locations that would provide maximum coverage while remaining invisible to casual inspection. His hands shook slightly as he worked, not from nervousness but from rage that someone his own age could be processed through this facility like merchandise waiting for shipment. Phoenix monitored their work while tracking sounds from the warehouse above. Vehicles arriving, doors slamming, voices giving orders in languages that revealed the international scope of the trafficking network. The buyers were gathering early, eager to inspect their purchases before making final selections. "Time check," Jackson whispered. 11:15, Phoenix replied. "Ship docks in 32 minutes. First buyers arrive in 25. The timeline was tightening like a noose. Every minute spent in preparation was one less minute for documentation, but rushing would mean missing critical evidence that could expose the entire network. They had to be perfect, thorough, and invisible all at once. Above them, the warehouse came alive with activity. Forklifts moving containers into position, workers preparing processing areas, guards taking positions that would prevent any interference with the night's business. The machinery of human trafficking operated with the efficiency of legitimate commerce, which made its crimes even more obscene. Stevens finished installing the last camera and gave a thumbs up. Martinez completed his photographic survey of the basement level. Jackson checked communication equipment that would broadcast everything they recorded to Agent Chen's federal task force. All systems were operational, all contingencies covered. Phoenix led them to a concealed position behind shipping containers that provided clear sight lines to the main processing area while keeping them hidden from guards and buyers. From here, they could document everything without being detected, assuming they could remain perfectly still and silent for the next 90 minutes. The first container truck arrived at 11:37, 10 minutes before the ship was scheduled to dock. Its cargo wasn't human, just supplies for the processing operation. Medical equipment, restraints, identification tags that would replace the names and identities of people who were about to become property. Jackson felt his training take over, the same mental discipline that had carried him through combat missions, where emotional reactions could get people killed. He focused on the technical aspects of their operation, checking camera angles and audio levels while blocking out the human implications of what they were documenting. Martinez wasn't as successful at emotional compartmentalization. His breathing became shallow as workers unloaded equipment that was clearly designed for restraining unwilling subjects. Chains, shackles, devices that looked more like torture instruments than transportation aids. Stevens whispered prayers under his breath, words his grandfather might have said during his own final mission decades ago. The young officer was discovering that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite terror that threatened to paralyze rational thought. Phoenix remained perfectly still, his enhanced senses tracking every movement in the warehouse above. His experience with similar operations had taught him that the most important evidence always emerged during the moments when criminals felt most secure, most confident that their activities were unobserved. The Meridian Star's horn echoed across the harbor at 11:47 p.m. exactly, announcing the arrival of cargo that Port Authority records would show as agricultural equipment. Within minutes, specialized trucks began moving toward the docks, their drivers following routes that avoided main thoroughfares and traffic cameras. "First transport incoming," Phoenix reported through their shared communication system. Container HC7739 will arrive in approximately 18 minutes. Jackson activated the recording equipment, ensuring that every second of the coming horror would be preserved for posterity and prosecution. The micro cameras Stevens had installed came online, providing multiple angles of the processing area where human beings would soon be sorted like packages in a distribution center. Martinez focused his camera on the warehouse entrance, ready to photograph every face that entered, every license plate that arrived, every piece of evidence that could connect specific individuals to the trafficking operation. His hands were steady now, professional training overriding personal revulsion. Stevens monitored communication frequencies, listening for radio chatter that might reveal security concerns or changes to operational procedures. The buyers were coordinating their arrivals, staggering entry times to avoid drawing attention from legitimate Port Authority personnel who might ask uncomfortable questions. Above them, the warehouse filled with men whose expensive suits and casual attitudes toward human suffering marked them as purchasers rather than sellers. They spoke in multiple languages, discussing their needs with the clinical detachment of livestock buyers at a cattle auction. Phoenix translated fragments of conversation that reveal of the operation. Buyers from the scope 7 different states, representing labor contractors, brothel operators, and private collectors who specialized in particular types of victims. The market for human beings was more diverse and more profitable than any of the officers had imagined. The first buyer arrived at 12:05 a.m., 30 minutes ahead of schedule. He moved through the warehouse like he owned it, checking processing equipment and discussing modifications with workers who treated him with the deference reserved for valued customers. This wasn't his first purchase. Wouldn't be his last. Jackson photographed the man's face, noting distinguishing features that would make identification possible, even if he used false documentation. The buyer was middle-dressed, carrying himself with the confidence aged, well of someone who had never faced consequences for his actions. Martinez captured images of the buyer's vehicle, a luxury sedan with plates that would later be traced through databases that revealed shell companies and offshore accounts. The financial networks that supported human trafficking were as complex as any legitimate international business. Stevens recorded conversations that revealed pricing structures and delivery schedules. Human beings were being discussed in terms of units and shipping costs, their value calculated based on age, physical condition, and intended use. The casual nature of these discussions was more horrifying than outright cruelty would have been. Phoenix monitored security frequencies, tracking guard positions and patrol schedules that would determine their extraction timing. The warehouse was becoming more crowded with each passing minute, increasing the risk of detection while providing more opportunities to document criminal activity. At 12:23 a.m., the first container truck arrived from the docks. Its cargo wasn't visible from their position, but the sounds that emerged when the doors opened told a story that no decent person should have to hear. Voices calling for help in languages that revealed the international scope of the victim's origins. Jackson forced himself to keep recording, as workers began unloading human cargo with the same efficiency they might use for any other merchandise. Men, women, children emerged from the container in conditions that violated every principle of human dignity and basic decency. Martinez captured photographs that would later be used in federal trials, images that documented not just criminal activity, but crimes against humanity. Each picture told a story of suffering that stretched back through transportation, processing, and initial capture in countries where poverty made people vulnerable to false promises. Stevens recorded audio that would become testimony in courts of law, voices that spoke of journeys that began with hope and ended in slavery. The victims were processed through the warehouse with systematic efficiency, their identities recorded, and their destinations assigned based on buyer preferences and payment arrangements. By dawn, 43 souls walked free while a network that had profited from human misery crumbled under the weight of irrefutable evidence. Phoenix and his 3 ghost officers had done more than document crimes. They had shattered a machine that fed on suffering and silence. The footage they broadcast ignited investigations across 7 states, toppling corrupt officials and freeing hundreds more victims from chains both literal and invisible. Sometimes justice doesn't come from courtrooms or badges. Sometimes it falls from the sky, carried by those willing to die for strangers they'll never meet. Phoenix had learned to fly again, not through the air, but through the darkness where monsters hide, bringing light to places that had forgotten hope existed. The desert wind still carried his name, but now it whispered of salvation rather than legend.